One night, unable to bear the pain, Okoli rose quietly and made his way to the graveyard, his steps as silent as a whisper. Under the pale light of the moon, he reached Uloma's resting place. His hands trembled, yet his sorrow pushed him forward. With each scoop of earth, he dug deeper until he saw her again, her face pale and still. Gently, he lifted Uloma's body and took her home, his heart pounding, his grief clouding his mind. Inside his home, he placed her body on a mat, lit a few candles, and began to chant softly. It was a dark, strange ritual. Words he had never spoken before, words filled with desperation. And then he laid on the cold body of Uloma, and from that night, he started sleeping with her. You see, Okoli wasn't always like this. In fact, he was known as the kindest man in Luku. Generous, humble, and deeply respected, Okoli held a special place in everyone's hearts. But to understand what led him to such a terrible act, we must go back to the time when Okoli was a rich man in the village of Luku. Long ago, in the prosperous village of Luku, Okoli was a man admired by all. Luku wasn't an ordinary place. It was a village blessed with wealth and power. Money sparkled like stars in Luku, and everyone respected the wealthy, hoping to someday gain riches of their own. Okoli was not only rich but also kind-hearted. He walked among the villagers like an equal, with dust on his feet and kindness in his eyes, despite being one of the wealthiest in Luku. He didn't wear fancy clothes or boast of his riches. Instead, he shared his blessings, giving freely to those in need, and even the elders spoke of him with pride. The villagers would say, "Look at Okoli, humble as he is rich, a blessing to our village." Whenever Okoli passed, the women would sway their hips and smile, hoping to catch his eye. But Okoli's heart was quiet, just like a still river at dawn. He had a girlfriend he loved, and her name was Uju, beautiful and kind as the morning sun. Luku shone bright with its riches, but little did the villagers know a dark shadow was waiting to fall. Okoli's girlfriend, Uju. Uju was as kind as the sun after the rain, warming everyone around her. She was gentle, with a heart that loved children deeply, and the whole village admired her for it. Children would run to her like bees to a flower, and she'd laugh and play with them, making their little faces shine with joy. One day, Uju decided to go for a walk. She took Adama, her neighbor's little daughter, along with her. Adama was the only child of her parents, precious like a single pearl. Uju held Adama's hand as they strolled, laughing and chatting under the trees. But when Uju came back home, Adama wasn't with her. She looked around, called Adama's name, but there was only silence. The whole village shook like leaves in a storm. "Where is Adama?" everyone asked, searching high and low. They looked in the fields near the river and behind every tree. But Adama was gone, as if she had vanished into thin air. People whispered, some with worry and others with suspicion. Fingers began to point at Uju. "She must be a witch," some said, their voices sharp like thorns. Even Okoli, the one who loved her, didn't know what to believe. His heart was heavy, like a stone, unable to see the truth. Uju's face grew pale as she heard the whispers. Her heart cracked like dry earth. She didn't wait another day. She packed her things, leaving the village to find Adama, determined to clear her name. Days turned into weeks and weeks into months. The memory of little Adama faded, like footprints washed away by the river. The villagers carried on, their busy lives sweeping the sorrow away. Only her family held on to the ache, though they grew silent, like trees bowing under the weight of a storm. But Okoli did not forget. He visited Adama's family often, bringing them gifts, sweet yams, baskets of fruits, anything to make them smile, even if just for a moment. Okoli is a good man, the villagers would say, rich and kind, a blessing to Luku. And the villagers praised him, their respect growing with each visit he made. Then one day, Okoli met a new woman. Her name was Uloma, and she was as graceful as a leaf dancing in the wind. Uloma was known all over Luku as the village's best dancer, moving her feet like flowing water. When she danced, even the oldest villagers would smile, and children would clap, caught in her spell. Okoli and Uloma became close, and their laughter filled the air like birdsong. People were happy to see them together. They said, "Ah, Okoli and Uloma, what a fine match." But little did the village know, shadows often hide behind the brightest lights. One morning, the village awoke to a heavy silence, the kind that clings to the air like a thick fog. Outside Uloma's house, her lifeless body lay still, her dancing feet now quiet forever. The news spread like wildfire, and the whole village felt a pang of sorrow. Uloma, the girl who could make even the stars dance, was gone. The villagers gathered around, their eyes wet with tears. They buried her with honor, her resting place surrounded by flowers, as bright as the memories she left behind. Songs of sorrow filled the air as they bid her farewell, a farewell too soon. But none grieved as deeply as Okoli. He wept for Uloma, his heart heavy as stone. Day after day, he stayed in his home, shadows under his eyes, his once bright spirit dimmed. The villagers, seeing his sadness, brought him food, sat by his side, and spoke soft words to ease his pain. "Be strong, Okoli," they whispered. "The sun will rise again." But Okoli only stared at the ground, lost in his sorrow, the emptiness of Uloma's absence filling every corner of his heart. And so, Luku mourned, while Okoli's world grew darker, like a night without stars. Okoli was heartbroken. He grieved day and night, the weight of loss pressing down on him like a heavy stone. The villagers tried to comfort him, bringing him food and speaking soft words to ease his sorrow, but Okoli only sank deeper into his grief. His world had turned dark, the joy and kindness within him fading like a flame without air. And it was in this darkness that a terrible thought took root in his mind. Desperate to cling to what he had lost, Okoli made his way to Uloma's grave under the pale light of the moon. There, his grief overtook him, and he dug up her body, carrying it home in the dead of night. He lit candles and chanted strange, dark words he'd never spoken before, believing that by lying beside her one last time, he might hold on to the riches that seemed to slip from his life like sand through his fingers. Meanwhile, Uju had traveled far, searching in every village, calling out Adama's name, like a mother calling her lost child. Her feet ached, her clothes were worn, but she would not stop until she found the little girl. After many months, her search finally led her to a small village where she found Adama, alive but weary. Uju's heart leapt with relief, and she promised Adama they would return home together. Late into the night, Uju and Adama finally reached the edge of Luku. The village lay silent under the stars, and shadows stretched across the paths. As they quietly walked toward the heart of the village, Uju noticed something strange. A figure moved slowly ahead, carrying something heavy. She squinted and felt her heart skip a beat. It was Okoli. Curiosity gripped her as she followed him to his home. Through the dim light of the window, she peeped inside. What she saw froze her to the bone. Okoli was lying beside Uloma's lifeless body, his face close to hers, his eyes empty as if trapped in a spell. Uju stifled a gasp, her hands covering her mouth. The sight was like a bad dream come to life. She stepped back, her heart pounding as the truth unraveled before her. The first light of dawn crept over Luku. bathing the village in a soft golden glow. As the sun rose higher, the villagers began their morning routines, preparing food, fetching water, tending to their fields. But then, like the roll of thunder, whispers started to spread from one corner of the village to the other. "Did you see?" a voice whispered. "Uju has returned," another murmured. And with her return, suspicion flickered like embers catching fire. "She's a witch," some voices shouted. Others joined in, louder and louder, their fear and anger growing. "Stone her! Drive her out!" The crowd gathered, their voices like a storm, ready to unleash their fury. But the village elders, wise and calm, raised their hands, silencing the mob. "Enough," said one elder, his voice steady like the roots of an old tree. "Bring Uju here. We must hear her story." When Uju stood before them, her face was tired, yet her eyes held a fierce determination. The elders looked her over, their gazes sharp and questioning. "Uju," said the oldest elder, his voice grave, "where have you been all these months? You vanished like a ghost." Taking a steady breath, Uju spoke. "I did not run away. I searched for Adama, the little girl who went missing. I walked far and wide, to every village I knew, calling her name until my voice was hoarse. And finally, I found her." As she finished speaking, she turned to the crowd. "Come forward, Adama," she called gently. From the edge of the crowd, Adama stepped forward, her small face a mixture of fear and confusion. Gasps rose from the villagers, and the crowd parted as she walked to Uju's side. Murmurs spread like ripples across a pond as the villagers realized Uju had been telling the truth all along. The elders, however, were not satisfied. "Where did you find her?" one of them demanded. "And what happened that day?" Uju's gaze turned dark as she spoke. "That day, Okoli saw us walking together and came to meet us. He told me he would take Adama home, and I trusted him. But when I returned, she was nowhere to be found. No one would believe me. You all called me a witch, even the man I loved." The crowd fell silent, the weight of her words settling over them like a heavy mist. They looked at Adama, then back at Uju, wondering what could have truly happened. And in that silence, a tension brewed, for the villagers sensed there was more to this story, more secrets hidden in the shadows. The crowd waited in tense silence, eyes fixed on little Adama as she stood before them, her small voice carrying the weight of a buried secret. "Tell us, Adama," an elder gently encouraged. "What happened that day?" Adama looked down, shuffling her feet as if afraid to remember. But with Uju by her side, she found the courage. Her voice was soft but clear, like the whisper of a breeze. "That day, Okoli saw us walking. He told Uju he'd take me home, so she let me go with him." The villagers held their breath, listening intently. "He didn't take me home," Adama continued, her voice trembling. "Instead, he left me with some strange men. They were big and scary. He told me, 'Wait here for Uju.' But Uju never came back." Gasps rippled through the crowd. They turned to each other in disbelief, faces twisted with shock and horror. Okoli, the man they had once praised and admired, had left an innocent child with strangers. The elders looked at Uju, their eyes demanding answers. She stood firm, her voice steady. "Last night, when I returned to Luku, I saw Okoli carrying something. I was curious, so I followed him and peeped into his home." She paused, her eyes narrowing. "What I saw was Uloma's corpse lying beside him, her body cold and lifeless." A collective gasp echoed through the crowd. Shock painted every face, and the villagers' eyes were wide with fear and disgust. Their beloved Okoli, who they thought so noble and pure, had been keeping his dead lover's body in his room. The elders exchanged grave glances, their voices now filled with anger and disbelief. "Is this true, Uju?" one of them asked, his tone a mix of sorrow and fury. "It is," Uju replied, her voice unwavering. "Okoli, the man you all cherished, has a darkness within him that none of us saw." The crowd's murmur grew louder, swelling with confusion, horror, and betrayal. In that moment, the villagers began to realize that the man they had adored might be hiding something darker than they could have ever imagined. Fueled by anger and betrayal, the villagers marched to Okoli's house like a roaring river, their voices rising in a wave of fury. They pounded on his door, and when he didn't answer, they broke it down, storming inside with faces twisted in rage. They found Okoli crouched in a corner, his face pale, knowing there was nowhere left to hide. They dragged him outside, his head low, his heart pounding. The whole village had gathered to see the man they once respected, now trembling before them. Uju and Adama stood at the front, their gazes steady and unforgiving. Okoli looked at them, his face filled with a mixture of fear and guilt. He knew he could no longer hide his sins. "What did you do, Okoli?" demanded an elder, his voice cold as steel. Okoli's hands shook, his eyes darting around like a trapped animal. Finally, he opened his mouth, his voice barely a whisper. I sold her. I sold Adama," he confessed, his voice cracking with fear. "I thought my riches were slipping away. I needed money, more and more, to keep my wealth. So I sold her to strangers." Gasps and cries of horror erupted from the crowd. Mothers covered their children's ears, fathers clenched their fists, and the elders looked at Okoli with a mix of disgust and sorrow. Okoli lowered his head, unable to meet their eyes. "I even thought of selling Uju," he continued, his voice hollow. But she didn't come back the way I expected. I had no choice." Uju's eyes burned with a mixture of pain and anger as she listened to the man she had once loved admit his terrible deeds. The crowd closed in tighter, their voices rising like a storm. The elders stepped forward, their faces grim. "Okoli, you have betrayed not only Uju but every single one of us. You traded innocence for coins, betrayed the trust of the village, and lied to the people who looked up to you." Okoli, seeing the fury in their eyes and knowing there was no escape, stood in silence. The weight of his crimes lay heavy in the air, and for the first time, he realized that all the riches he had craved were worth nothing in the face of such darkness. The crowd stood frozen, eyes wide, breaths held, waiting for Okoli to reveal the full extent of his darkness. His voice was low, hollow, each word carrying a weight that settled over the villagers like a heavy fog. "When Uju left," Okoli began, his voice trembling, "I feared my wealth would fade. I could feel it slipping, like sand through my fingers. I needed more." He glanced at the ground, unable to meet their eyes. "So, I went to a powerful priest, a man of dark ways. He promised me a way to keep my wealth strong, but his solution was not ordinary." The villagers shifted, uneasy, as he continued. "The priest told me," Okoli went on, his voice barely a whisper, "that I must perform a dark ritual. He said I needed a life I cherished. Only that would be strong enough to bind the riches to me forever." Gasps spread through the crowd, and some covered their mouths in shock. Mothers held their children close while the elders stared at Okoli, their faces hardening with disgust. "Uloma," he said, his voice cracking. "She was the life I cherished. I was desperate, blinded by greed. So I took her life. I followed the priest's instructions. using her body in strange rites, believing that through her, my wealth would be eternal. The villagers cried out in horror, unable to comprehend the man who stood before them. Okoli had not only betrayed the living, but had defiled the dead, his greed turning him into a monster hidden in plain sight. The eldest of the village elders stepped forward, his voice cold. You took the purest heart and corrupted it with darkness, all for coins and power. Your actions have tainted this village, Okoli, and they cannot be forgiven. Okoli's head hung low, for he knew there was no excuse left. The crowd began to murmur, anger growing like flames, as they prepared to bring justice to the man who had stained their village with his vile deeds. The villagers, still reeling from Okoli's confession, moved cautiously toward his house. Their hearts pounded as they pushed open the door, stepping inside the darkened room, where shadows seemed to cling to every corner. As their eyes adjusted, gasps and cries filled the air. Human skulls lay scattered across a table, grinning with hollow, empty eyes. Bones of unknown origin, some tiny, some large, were scattered around like pieces of an evil puzzle. Feathers, black as midnight, were strung together and hung from the walls, swaying eerily in the dim light. In the center of it all lay strange markings on the floor, symbols that twisted in unnatural shapes, filling the room with a sense of dread. The villagers took steps back, fear twisting their faces. This was not the home of a kind, wealthy farmer. It was the lair of a man lost to dark and terrible things, a man who had become something unrecognizable. One elder turned to the others, his voice shaking. We praised him, honored him, trusted him. An old woman, clutching her shawl tightly around her shoulders, whispered, and all the while he hid this darkness. We were blind. The villagers exchanged looks of disbelief and sorrow, realizing that the man they had admired had deceived them all, hiding his wickedness behind the mask of a humble and generous heart. The children of the village peered through the door, their faces pale, as they, too, began to understand the betrayal that had shadowed their village. The eldest elder took a deep breath, his voice steady but cold. This evil can no longer remain in Luku. He has poisoned our village with his greed and darkness. The villagers, their fear now replaced by a fierce resolve, prepared to carry out justice on the man who had shattered their trust and tainted their home. The villagers, their hearts hardened by anger and betrayal, dragged Okoli to the large, ancient tree that stood in the heart of Luku. Its roots ran deep, twisting through the village like veins, as if it held the memory of every life, every secret, and every sorrow. Okoli stood silent, his eyes downcast, knowing there was no escape from what was to come. The law of Luku was as old as the village itself. Whoever kills shall be killed. It was simple and it was final. There was no room for mercy for a man who had defiled their trust and spilled innocent blood. Innocent. The villagers with stones in hand surrounded Okoli. His once proud figure now seemed small, swallowed by the shadows of the very people he had betrayed. One by one, they cast their stones, each throw filled with the pain, anger, and betrayal he had left in their hearts. The sound of the stones echoed through the village like thunder rolling across the hills. When it was over, the people of Luku stood still, their faces solemn, the weight of justice heavy in the air. The betrayal was gone, but its memory lingered, leaving a dark stain on their hearts, a reminder that even the brightest smiles could hide shadows. From that day forward, the people of Luku grew cautious of those who wore wealth like a crown. They remembered Okoli's tale, and it whispered to them in quiet moments, beware, For riches may hide secrets, and even the kindest faces can deceive. And so they carried on, wary but wiser, knowing that trust was more precious than gold, and that shadows often lay behind the brightest lights. I hope you enjoyed the tale. If so, please like the video, share it with your family and friends, comment on it, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell for more enchanting tales like this one. Goodbye.